welcome back to MFA Writers. I hope you're all doing well out there. We're quickly approaching the end of the spring semester, so if you're a student, I hope you're holding up as courses quickly wrap up. Summer will be here before you know it. Before we get to our episode today, I want to send a big thank you to Robin Seller, who recently signed up to become a monthly donor to the podcast at buymeacoffee.com. It means so much to us here at the podcast when people donate, and doing so regularly gives us that much more financial flexibility. So thank you so much, Robin. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. We love to hear from listeners, so feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms, or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Also, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show, you can apply at mfawriters.com. On that same website, you can also click the support button to support us financially, if it's within your means. Or you can do so by going directly to buymeacoffee.com/MFAWriters. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Abhijit Sarmah. Abhijit is a poet and a researcher of indigenous literatures with particular focus on Native American women writers and writings from the northeast of India. Currently, he is a second-year PhD student in the creative writing program at the University of Georgia, where he is also an Arts Lab graduate fellow. He was a finalist for the 2023 Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Poetry Fellowship, and his work has appeared in magazines like Poetry, The Margins, Lincoln Review, and elsewhere. Today, Abhijit has brought two poems to read for us.
The first poem I'll read today is called Never Heard Back. It's a pandemic poem and a prose poem. So here it goes. Never heard back. Tomorrow, they won't know an emptying body from a ceremonial sunset. And we who are left on crinoline Sunday mornings will write down recipes from our mother's oil-marked magazines for luncheons our lovers never show up for. We'll enjoy the greasy taste of a city left to oniric requiems. We'll count ice packs left on the bed in the dark. Some afternoons I count shadows of tiny birds on my father's knees, and on others I count people in the supermarket just to remind myself that the world is a lot lonelier now, but not just to me. No one buys cheap stoneware dishes for their old mothers. They stand quietly at the counter and intone spindly summer thoughts for their kids. And the kids, othered from the loss, groove to the mock static of indifference. The supermarket is always loud, but not sad enough to drown the convulsions of our loneliness. So we hold on to our stories till our grief crests and tides like morning sunlight on river walks. Is it enough to say we can no longer look into each other's eyes without crying, without believing we are buffeting apart the graced hearts of our enemies? How will one explain this nightmare to their lovers for comfort? Perhaps every percussive song ladling out of this ungodly ossuary clams an answer. Truth. The maps of absence are full of wilting shadows and the hearts nailed with human guilt. Now we can see why our mothers prayed but didn't have the courage to love. The world always finds its ways to pencil despair over our flesh. I'm not even exaggerating when I say in this empty house I can hear you whine about grapefruit stains on your winter coat. For you, I sing the same songs and read the same obit. The back door opens to a plain blue evening. Please don't leave. So the second poem I will read is In Memoriam Sam Stafford. Sam Stafford was a 17-year-old kid who was killed in Assam by the police during the anti-CAA protests in 2019. There's another word you need to know. It's called Hawali. Hawali flowers are actually what we call in English night blooming jasmine. So that's all you need to know to better understand the poem. In Memoriam, Sam Stafford. The minute the bullet pierced his face, the sky, so moon-flooded, collapsed into a rhapsody, and the city swelled with lilac wildflowers. It was a winter of untamable fire and bitter nostalgia, brother. In our turn, we funneled into history like canvassed nights through slimy skylines, or dreams of Hawali flowers on porcelain August afternoons. Look, we torched all that was left of the untended dragnets. We jeered at the dead river, rotten pineapple black. We scrubbed clean the time-worn mildewed dirges. We raised heaven until its flotsams became plagues. Yet the minute the bullet pierced his face, time's desultory trusts hurried towards its cobbled shadows and watched his frothy mouth snap into a pallet of meat and his body into a russet-haired mannequin, icy stiff and frayed, overwound by fervid songs of Bishnu Rabha and Jyoti Prasad to the bleeding pleats of the night. When the tanned soil got soaked with unfathomable grief and his sharp shriek scooted through the wet warrens of amnesia, a sweltering avalanche of convulging springs crashed by a lot of clean history and landed on 855 buried headstones, a fiery bunch, but Sam walked away with slow gait through a Saladin street while those of us who stayed wintered in ooh.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for reading that, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast, Jared.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you. I'm really glad you agreed to come on. I've read a bit of your poetry, and anyone else who's read your poetry will know that your upbringing in Assam, India, has been a major influence on you as a person and a writer. So maybe we can start there. What was it like growing up in Assam? Maybe tell us about your home and your childhood there.
Well, I was born and brought up in a small town in Assam called Dibrugarh. It's next to India's widest river, Brahmaputra, that often appears in our literary works as the Red River. It's also home to a lot of tribes and communities. Let's put a fun fact. Assamese is actually an umbrella term used to define a myriad of tribes and communities that call Assam their home. So I grew up listening to a lot of folk tales and folk songs, not just from one tribe or community. That is also reflected in my work. I draw in folk tales and folk songs from a lot of tribes that I grew up around. It's a beautiful state, also home to one-horned rhinos. But also underneath the beauty, there is also a dark side. I grew up listening about a lot of kidnappings and extortions. Those are some of my core memories. So there were several insurgencies against the Indian nation state while I was growing up, and the Indian army did torture and kill a lot of my people. So when I think of Assam, I don't really romanticize it, but yeah. So if you read my work, you won't find me romanticizing about all good things in Assam, but also things are getting better now.
You mentioned like growing up around all those different cultures. I imagine Storytelling must have been a big part of your childhood then, right? Did you grow up hearing people tell a lot of stories?
Yes, in fact, my grandmother was a superb storyteller, and some of my best childhood memories actually revolves around my grandmother telling me stories before going to sleep. But also the fact that I grew up in a society that is so inclusive, so I kind of picked up stories from here and there. I mean, back in the day, obviously, I didn't know that I would write about them in the long run. But now I can see where all my stories, all my, the way I write, the way I think, the way I perceive the world comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that had a big influence on you as a writer. At what point did you start writing? Like, were you writing as a kid growing up in Assam?
Oh, it's a funny story. I started writing at the age of 9, actually, and also in English. But since English is not my mother tongue, there was, those were some real bad writing. But I took writing seriously while I was in college. Even though creative writing was not part of our curriculum, my professors were very supportive of my efforts. And I'm mostly self-taught. I do not have an MFA, but since I'm a student of literature, I was anyway exposed to writings from different countries and continents. I think that helped a lot. I remember reading a lot of Aga Shahid Ali, Mahmoud Darwish, June Jordan, James Merrill. So the fact that I am a student of literature helped me become a poet, I guess.
Yeah. Hey, I'll say, English is my mother tongue, and my early stories were really bad too. So maybe that's just part of the process. We have to go through a period of writing really bad stuff before we can write really good stuff. And you're writing really good stuff now. So I'm curious, at what point did you start focusing on poetry? When did poetry become the thing that you were super interested in?
Oh yeah, I always wanted to be a fiction writer. So as I said, I started quite early at the age of 9, and because we don't have. Now we have creative writing programs in India, but while I was growing up, we didn't have any creative writing program. And so I knew I was on my own. And so I read a lot of fiction at that point, but I remember the night I encountered Allen Ginsberg's Howl. It's a funny story. I always tell people that I am a poet because I read Howl, because I remember reading Howl and realizing and telling myself, oh, you can tell your story through poetry too. And that's how it started. I remember it was first year in college. And that poem literally brought me to poetry, and I've been a poet ever since.
Yeah, I can imagine that poem brought a lot of people to poetry. I actually have a copy. It's a vinyl record of Allen Ginsberg reading Howl. It's like amazing to hear him in his own voice reading that poem. It still brings me chills. So yeah, I can understand how it would have inspired you. So with it in mind that your homeland, Assam, your upbringing there is so influential to your writing, I'm curious to hear you talk about what it's like to live in Georgia now and write about that place. Like, what's it like writing about your home when you're not living there?
Distance is good. Like, while I was in Assam, I could not really perceive the good and the bad objectively. So it's similar to judging a painting. You have to stand at a particular distance to see what is good and bad about that painting. You won't know while you're doing that painting, or it's like writing a poem. You cannot know the worth of a poem until and unless you distance yourself from it for a long time. And I must also mention this, that Native American writers have taught me a lot about how to think about home.
In addition to being a poet, you also describe yourself as a researcher. And speaking of Native American writers, I know that you do some research into them. So do you mind telling us a bit about your research focus and your research process?
Yeah, so I'm a scholar of Native American literatures with primary focus on Native American women writers. I wrote my MPhil dissertation on post-memories of violence in memoirs by Native American women writers. And I think my interest in Native American literatures come from my interest in marginalized writings. And I am from a marginalized community in India. So, you get the drift where the interest comes from. So so it's interesting because when I meet fellow scholars here in the States and I tell them that I'm from Assam and I work on Native American literatures, they're often surprised by the fact that, oh, do people read Native American literature in India? They really do. They really do. So there's a huge body of work that's done even by Assamese writers. Like they write about Native American people in Assamese, and there are a lot of books.
Yeah, like tell me a bit more about, I don't know, I guess your research process. How do you use your research to influence your writing?
Oh yeah, my research really helps me in understand. I mean, for example, I work on post memories of violence in Native American memoirs, so it really helps me to locate or see how even my post memories of violence, works in my work. And like the poetry that I write or, in any kind of writing that I do, I didn't have a term to describe the memories that I talk about because I realized it quite early that I was writing about some events and I have some memories that are not my personal memories, and they were always there. And but it was only after I started doing my research that I came across the term post-memory, and I knew it right away that what I'm dealing with in my work are post-memories of violence. And I think now I know how to, in some way, structure them because I know how Native American writers do it. So I'm in some way trying to learn from them.
For anyone who doesn't know, could you tell us what does post-memories mean?
Oh, post-memories are memories which are not your personal memories, but the kind of memories that we inherit in various ways. They are memories that are passed on to us. I mean, for example, in a family setting, the stories that our grandparents tell us, all the visuals that you see on TV growing up, the news. I mean, I remember, like, I was a kid when the counterinsurgency drives were happening in Assam, and I mean, there is no way I can remember because I was like a kid of 4 or 5 when everything actually ended, when it was like, the drives were kind of over. So post memories are those memories which are not your memories, but I mean, they're not your personal memories, but memories that you inherit.
Like when I think about research, I think when a lot of people think about research, they think about going to a library, looking for books, looking through the archives, doing research that way. And I imagine that is part of your research. Mm-hmm. But I also think research can be talking to people who went through these experiences, right? So just hearing you talk about how like that insurgency was not that long ago, like you were a kid. Mm-hmm. I imagine like speaking with friends, relatives, I imagine that's part of your research as well.
Yeah. So, okay, it's great that you brought that up. I mean, while I was growing up, literally nobody talked about it. Like about the fact that, the whole state went through a bloodbath for a long time, for decades, right? But by the time I was in college, that was the time when I started realizing, or I started reading. That is what happened when I was in college. I started learning about what happened in Assam a couple of decades ago. And I realized, wait, that just happened like a decade ago and nobody's talking about it. And that is where I was like, oh, I need to know more about this. I think that is where where I was curious and I felt I need to read about it. And when I started reading about what happened in Assam during that insurgency period or during the counter-insurgency drives, I mean, I felt like I should write about it. That's my story. I mean, I think we all have, when we aspire to be writers or we begin aspiring to be writers, we always ask this question that what's my story, right? Because there's always this feeling that everything that I want to talk about or write about is already written. I mean, I had a similar thing going on where it's like, wait, what should I write about? And it was in the very first year of college, I knew what I would write for the rest of my life. And I have never stopped in the last 10 years.
Okay, so after you've done that research and you've heard those stories, you found that inspiration, what does your writing process look like? How does it go from that kind of outside information into a poem?
Oh, yeah. So my writing process has actually changed a lot over the years. I think of writing as a sacred process. I come to writing with the realization that a lot of people from where I am do not have the agency to tell their stories like me. So, I mean, there can be various reasons for that. But every time I sit down to write, I know that I'm the medium through which stories are getting told. And I mean, my ancestors speak through me. So my first drafts are often unmediated writing, but then I come back to it time and again and keep shaping it up until I feel confident enough to send it out. So, that is the point where my research kicks in. So, I mean, the facts and figures and data that I collect all the time. So, and moreover, I invest most of my time in learning my craft. But, good poems, I believe, come from somewhere else. And I don't have a term for that. You
mentioned earlier how your background's not in creative writing. You don't have an MFA. Mm-hmm. Your undergraduate degree and your master's degrees are in English literature, not creative writing. So what made you decide to pursue a PhD with a creative writing focus?
Because I get to do both creative writing and research. In fact, the degree I'm pursuing right now is a PhD in English with a creative dissertation. So we do everything that critical PhDs do. It's only the dissertation that will be different, but also it will be a coming together of both critical writing and creative writing. So that's the sole reason why I chose to get a PhD in English with a creative dissertation.
Did you have much experience in a workshop setting before the PhD?
No, not actually, because I didn't go and have an MFA, right? I didn't have an MFA. But yeah, talking about workshops, it's only after coming to the States and joining my program that I really found myself in a workshop setting. So, since I don't have an MFA, I'm not the right person to answer in comparison as to how the workshops work here. But the workshops here are small, and thus we learn a lot, not from the instructors, but also from my friends in the program who are accomplished poets, fiction writers, and translators. I mean, you get it because it's a PhD program. And I'm not even lying when I say that I am a fan of my friends. Like, the best part is that all of them are writers, scholars. And so the feedback they share are really insightful. And for someone like me with no MFA, I learn a lot.
I'm curious what it's like, because your poetry is so rooted in Assamese culture and history. I don't know if there are any other Assamese writers in your program, but I'm curious what it's like workshopping stuff that maybe the readers might not have a strong background on that information.
I think, for sure. Not a lot of people are aware of, the history that I write about, the place I write about. I always have to give a context, but I don't hate doing that, because I kind of understand that even I cannot claim that I know, say, the history of Georgia or something. So during the workshops, I kind of give a context as to what the poem is talking about, if it's needed. But mostly the workshop is done on the level of craft. That's why it's not much of a hindrance.
Do you have any advice for other international students who might be coming into MFA programs or PhD programs in the States without that workshop experience? Just like any advice for them on how to get the most out of it?
I think the only advice I have for writers who have never been a part of a workshop setting is to, I think, in some way, join online workshops before you really come down for an MFA or a PhD. It really helps if you really know the structuring of how the structure works. I mean, obviously everyone have their own workshop structure. I mean, practices are different from country to country. I mean, if the workshops in India are way different than the workshops in the States. So I think you should perhaps, take part in a few online workshops and see how it works, the way, things are presented, the way the critiquing part goes. So I think that would really be helpful.
Okay, so let's talk a bit more about that PhD program at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, which, as you said, is officially called the PhD in English Literature with Creative Dissertation. It's a 5-year program where students focus on poetry, fiction, nonfiction, translation, or interdisciplinary work. What made this program the right choice for you?
Oh, I chose this program solely for the faculty here. So I'm pretty proud of the fact that I get to work with some of my favorite writers and poets. My major professor, as I said, is Native American writer and scholar Lian Howe, author of Miko Kings and Savage Conversations. And I'm also a huge fan of poet professor Andrew Zawacki. We have some other famous writers and poets too, including Professor Aruni Kashyap and Professor Magdalena Zurowski. So I really came to UGA just because I really wanted to work with the poets and writers we have in the program.
Well, in my opinion, I think all students in MFA programs or PhD programs can benefit a lot from like that close mentorship with faculty. Mm-hmm. I can imagine this is even more important when studying in another country. At least it would be for me if I was studying abroad. Have you felt like you've gotten like that close mentorship and developed those close relationships with the faculty that you went there to study with?
Oh, yes. I mean, since we do not have a lot of graduate students in the program, we get the chance to interact with our faculty a lot. And all of them are so supportive and always there when we need them. They are the loudest cheerleaders of our work. Also, as I said, I learned so much from each one of them. For me, it's really an honor to have them as my mentors.
And what about the sense of community amongst the students? Do you feel like you've been able to create good relationships within the program with your cohort?
Yeah, it's a very strong community we have here. I mean, I know it will sound like a cliche, but we are like a close family here, and always helping each other in times of need, and always helping each other primarily to grow as writers. So yes, the community is very strong up here.
I don't think it sounds cliche. I always love to hear it. Anytime someone says that they've got good relationships with their cohort, with their faculty, I'm happy to hear it. So I'm glad that's the case with you. Okay, so we talked earlier a little bit about the differences between an MFA and a PhD program in creative writing. And besides the length of the program, one of the big differences is that with the MFA, you're mostly just focused on the creative writing, while with a PhD, you do the critical work and the creative work. So I'm curious to hear you talk about what research or critical classes you've taken at UGA that you think have been really good.
To be honest, I have loved every single research-focused class so far. I mean, majority of our classes are research-focused, but if I have to choose one research-focused class that really had a great impact on my writing, I would say that's a class I took last semester with Professor Barbara McCaskill on Harlem Renaissance. And I wrote a paper on James Weldon Johnson that I'm pretty proud of for the class. But yeah, so while I was studying James Weldon Johnson, I mean, it kind of really helped me to think, because he was someone who, I mean, he was one of the critical figures to have started the Harlem Renaissance. So so that really, I mean, his work really taught me as to how to, in some way, think of your community, or how in some way to organize a body of literature. Because I remember I'm paraphrasing something that he said, but I think it's one of his very famous quotations that, no people looks down at other people if they have created a good body of work, a good body of literature. And he did that. He worked on a lot of anthologies. He worked on, he wrote a book of sermons, and he collected a lot of poems written by African American writers. So that class was very helpful, because it gave me an idea as to how to really create a body of work that that can really make the world aware of the culture, the history, the people of any country or of any part of the world.
Well, I imagine that all of these critical classes are going to come in handy next year when you start your comprehensive exams, which for anyone who doesn't know, that's another way in which a PhD program is different. The first couple of years, you tend to do critical and creative work. The third year is mainly focused on that comprehensive exam. And then the fourth and fifth year, you're focused on that dissertation. So you are coming to the end of your second year in the program. Have you begun preparing for those comprehensive exams? What's that process like?
Right now, I'm preparing my reading lists, and I'm actually doing lists on Native American life writing, and another one on African American life writing. I'm also doing a list on post-colonial literature, and lastly on poetry and photography. So, I mean, even though it's not kind of finalized, I'm imagining my dissertation to be a hybrid text. So so I am kind of structuring my lists so that, they will in some way help me in the long run when, once I'm done with my comms, once I'm done with my comms and start writing my dissertation.
How many books are on that list?
I will somewhere read around 150 books for sure across lists.
Wow. And that'll all be in about 1 year's time?
I know, yes.
Okay, everyone listening is like, okay, I don't want to do a PhD.
But it's fun, because if you love literature, if you love writing, and if you are really, for someone like me who is always, curious to know how writers talk about or deal with things that I write or deal with in my writing, it's a fun experience for someone like me.
Yeah. No, I've talked to several PhD students at this point, and they all say the comprehensive exams, that reading list was super intimidating, but they got so much out of it. They learned so much from that process. So I'll be really curious to hear in a year from now how you're feeling and how it's affected your creative work. I bet it's going to take you in some really interesting directions.
I'm really excited about it. I'm really excited to see where, how that will really change my writing. I'm sure it will, because I'll be reading 150 books, things will change.
No doubt. Okay. So I'm also curious to hear about life outside of the classroom. What's it like living in Athens, Georgia?
Athens is a small college town, but it's so fun to live here. There are literary events happening all the time. If you have lived in big cities, then perhaps you will not you will find Athens a bit discouraging. But this is truly a mecca for literature lovers because we have some amazing libraries and bookshops. They will not dishearten you. Trust me on this. And talking about readings in campus or outside, we have our graduate reading series called the Sentimental Touring Club. It's an event where a lot of our graduate students come together. We read our work, we share work. It's also a good place to know what all your friends are working on because you don't see them all the time. And all of us want to know what our friends are working on. And those readings, we have a lot of readings that happen off campus. And last year we had another event. It was called One Night Only, where we read our experimental works. So yeah, it's fun up here. So it's not, even though Athens is a small place, a lot of fun stuff happens here. And we have the best bookshops up here. So we have Avid Bookstore. Shout out to Avid Bookstore. It's a wonderful bookstore up here.
Well, it seems like the program has turned out to be really good for you. It sounds like you're having a good time. I'm glad to hear that. Before we go, I just want to give you the last word, the last question I ask all of our guests when they come on. What is one way in which, in your case, the PhD experience has been different, for better or for worse, from your expectations when applying?
I did not expect that my professors would be super supportive. I did not expect I would have such a wonderful, supportive community of friends. There are some of the amazing people, and as I said, I absolutely love the courses that are offered at UGA, and I am very excited than ever to move forward with my research and creative writing, which, as I said, is like two sides of the same coin for me.
Well, comprehensive exams right around the corner, and then after that, the creative dissertation. I wish you nothing but the best. Thanks for coming on. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much, Jared.